Okay, in this part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about youth cultures. So, very broadly, youth culture is, the cultures of youth, what young people do in their leisure time, their creative time, in their social lives. I'm making a kind of distinction here with two streams of youth studies research that were kind of quite separate in the past, but have been brought together much more today. Youth culture on the one hand, and youth transitions on the other. I'll talk about transitions in the next lecture. So, again, like when you're thinking about youth broadly as a kind of generation or of people that are born at one time and living in the world right now, they're obviously not all the same and practice and do different things in their day-to-day lives. They don't go to the same places, don't, wear the same clothes, listen to the same music. Things like culture, the countries they live in, the places they live in, even in Australia, the difference between rural, suburban, urban kind of places, mean that the kind of things that young people do in their day-to-day life, their everyday life, are different and tend to, gather around various kind of, markers of inequality and markers of identity. But youth culture tends to be a little bit different, than what older people do. Older people tend to get more conservative. They tend to do less things, go out less, pursue things less. That's kind of changed a little bit over the past couple of decades, as much research shows that kind of people often pursue their youth culture practices later in life today. But overall, youth culture is seen as that kind of youthful, edgy, cool, sexy kind of things that young people are doing. This is particularly the case these days when it comes to digital technologies, and much cultural practices today are kind of mediated through those. What we'll look at in this part, and in particular, is a particular way to look at it through the notion of subculture. That there's kind of divisions in subculture, often oversimply defined as kind of, the alternate and subculture on the one side and the more kind of mass and mainstream on the other. But we can kind of use this as a way of thinking about the different leisure practices, fashions, appearances, different languages people use, taste and things, music and stuff like that, and how things like gender, age, class, race, locality, and all that kind of stuff play a role in who does what. Very broadly here, if we go back to the previous weeks in the course, you can think about how youth culture practices kind of reflect the socialisation process of young people, their habitus and their tastes. So youth culture is really good to study because it gives access to kind of all these really interesting sociological things. And we know that young people pursue youth culture for a plethora of different reasons. They're often very different than the kind of narcissistic, instant gratification kind of moral panic kind of ways that these things are discussed in the mainstream media. So, young people want to create their identity in that liminal period for being a child and adult. It's a real key to kind of, discovering who you are and what you want to be, what your identity is. And often in this period, young people are kind of, in a way, trying on different labels, trying on different versions of themselves to discover that. This is particularly done through the family, but more so the school and out into kind of the social world beyond the school and different institutions. So youth cultural practices are often about like being someone, about finding belonging and those around you that you belong with and who you want to be around. And are very key to kind of that rites of passage kind of thing from child to adult, kind of various ways of learning how to kind of be in the world and how to practice in various social situations. Youth cultures kind of almost different versions of them provide like an instruction manual, to kind of how to be in the world, like what choices to make and who you want to be around. There's so much kind of choice out there these days in terms of, consumer culture stuff we looked at earlier in the course, that it's confusing. And so, different youth cultural practices and subcultures and fashions and scenes and all this kind of stuff can, help overcome some of that confusion. For some of the kind of more rebellious and resistive subcultures as part of youth cultural practice, they've been theorised as a kind of symbolic refuge from being marginalised or being discriminated against. Many young people who feel like they don't necessarily fit in with the other peers around them, the dominant norms, or feel like they want to express themselves artistically or politically in ways that go against dominant norms often are attracted to various kinds of subcultures. This can help them at an individual level in terms of, addressing things like loneliness, shyness, depression, exposure to bullying, feelings of alienation. It's definitely helpful for, meeting people that have common interests with you and be able to kind of develop friends and life partners and sexual partners through that. So it's kind of seen as a way of kind of shoring up the future, finding people around you to kind of get along with. And also, importantly, it's seen as a way of kind of self-expression, expressing creativity, artistic expression, and often a form of politics. This is particularly the case with the more spectacular youth subcultures that are often kind of seen as creating a resistant identity position. So there's been numerous ways to think about that in social sciences. The dominant ones have been the Frankfurt School and the Birmingham School when it comes to youth studies. And we looked at the Frankfurt School at some length previously in the course. Essentially, the Frankfurt School, the likes of Adorno and Horkheimer, Marcuse, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, and others, see pop culture and consumer cultural practices as essentially being ideological. They're repressive, commercial. They express capitalist needs, not true human needs. They're all pseudo-individualizing. They kind of make you feel like you're the individual, but really you're conforming. The Birmingham School, though, come along and kind of critically engage with this. But at the time, in the late 60s and 70s, was the dominant conceptual view of youth culture and pop culture and consumer culture. They started to see these, smaller subcultural groups of young people doing their youth culture in a way that wasn't reflective of dominant capitalist ideology, and that were expressions of rebellion and subversion. So here we have things like punk and goth, mods and rockers and those kinds of things, often around music scenes and cultures. So both of these points of view have quite Marxist influence. They both see class as being fundamental to pop culture, but kind of see it in different ways. Where the Frankfurt School see just pop culture and youth culture in general as being essentially capitalist ideology. There's no real escape. It's all to kind of creating false needs and encouraging us to buy and not encouraging us to be creative and think about our place in the world and seizing the means of production or whatever. The Birmingham School say, well, hang on a minute. There's these other people coming along that are kind of practicing their cultural practice in a way that does seem to express rebellion and resistance against these dominant norms. And so the way the Birmingham School saw this was the first key book about this was a notion of resistance through rituals. The subcultural practices, whether it's the fashion, whether it's the music, whether it's the gigs, whether it's organising political rallies or whatever, was done through this kind of anthropological ritualistic way, and a way of kind of setting up a kind of relative autonomy to live your life the way that you want to live within these kind of dominant norms. Now the key difference here is that where the kind of more Frankfurt School understanding of kind of Marxist theory would argue that to resist you had to kind of have a revolutionary intent to overthrow the means of production and create a better world. The Birmingham School kind of position resistance not in that revolutionary sense, but more as a kind of everyday making do kind of sense. That it's unrealistic for kind of groups of young people to kind of want to overthrow capitalism. What they do instead is find ways to resist, find ways to create, find ways to express themselves that don't necessarily replicate dominant norms, but do so in these kind of more symbolic ways and often through their own kind of what they call politics of pleasure. So they kind of channel their subversion to dominant norms through these kind of everyday subcultural practices. So the Birmingham School did, a whole suite for a couple of decades of studies of different subcultures, the mods, punks, skinheads, rude boys, and so on. What was interesting in this at the time is that, there was critique about, just how accurate the positioning of these subcultures as some kind of working class resistance was. Many of the people participating in were kind of more well-educated, kind of art school, kind of middle-class people. Punk's a good example of that. Like people like Susie Sue or Joe Strummer went to art school. But and there was also some real gendered critiques of this. Many of the early subcultural studies were mostly about men and left women kind of on the sidelines, and created this kind of men in public space, women in private space in terms of where people do their youth cultural practices. And so there's some really interesting research that reacts against that and critiques that. But overall, it was seen that there was this kind of possibility of being creative and being resistive by doing youth culture. Of course, there's critique of that as well, and many people argue that just these subcultures were just kind of, symbolic resistance, not really material or structural or real resistance. They weren't necessarily changing the world for the better. They were just kind of, dancing or singing and that kind of thing. So what's important about the subcultural understanding, though, and the kind of various conceptual understandings of pop culture and consumer culture and youth culture that it's kind of driven over the past couple of decades, is it starts to kind of position, culture itself, unlike those Frankfurt School Marxists, as just kind of ideology, but more as a site of struggle. And struggle over how the world should be kind of happens, in this realm. So pop culture, youth culture and the like becomes a site of struggle where cultural choices, things like music and fashion, can represent resistance or even like ironic challenges to existing norms. A key researcher here was Stuart Hall, saw pop culture as a contested site for political constructions of the people. Resistance here is symbolic and happens through rituals and cultural mixing or through the notion of bricolage. Bricolage is the kind of use of everyday things and done in a creative and subversive way. So here, having a haircut like the mohawk, having a various haircut is kind of just a normal thing to have. But having one that's symbolic like this is kind of positions you as an outsider. It's a deliberate kind of attempt to kind of, fall outside dominant norms. Now, at the time, in the 70s or whatever, mohawks were pretty out there, and if you saw a punk walking down the street, you would know they were punk because they had a mohawk. Today, something like the mohawk isn't necessarily as challenging as it used to be. It's become more accepted. You have kind of more conservative versions of them, and at kind of high fashion hairdressers and stuff like that. Now you get them. They don't necessarily symbol that resistance anymore. So importantly here, what's important is how these symbolic mechanisms can be challenged and changed over time, and often they can be co-opted. And so an example of this again would be something like in grunge. Kurt Cobain was famous for wearing like $2 flannels, to kind of symbolize his kind of poor upbringing, and wasn't really interested in fashion and stuff like that. But as soon as Nirvana becomes the biggest band in the world, replicas of those kind of torn flannel shirts are sold in boutiques for hundreds of dollars. So the symbolic meaning can be easily co-opted in that sense, and this is one of the kind of challenges to subcultural theory about whether it can actually be true resistance if it's just largely symbolic. But importantly here, like there's many versions of this, punks also wore garbage bags as clothing to kind of symbolize how they felt like they were being treated like garbage. An example of bricolage, I think, is, young people using car parks or swimming pools and stuff like that to skate in. A car park is something that's like people are meant to come to use to go shopping or go to work. That public space is reinvented and reused creatively by skaters for their own self-expression that goes against those dominant norms. So these everyday examples are kind of seen as resistance through that kind of realm. Importantly here, it's not challenging the system as a whole. It's not trying to be revolutionary. That's creating a measure of autonomy to live within it. So again, unlike the kind of Frankfurt School point of view, pop culture, youth culture, consumer culture is seen as much as a place of practice as it is as a place of consumption. Okay, I'll leave that there and come back and talk about youth transitions.